There is something nobody prepares you for on the way up. As you grow, as you develop your skills, your confidence, your presence, and your ability to create real results in the world, you will begin to encounter a very specific and very confusing kind of resistance. It will not come from strangers. It will not come from open enemies. It will come from the people closest to you. Colleagues who suddenly become oddly competitive. Friends who make cutting remarks disguised as jokes. Family members who subtly undermine your decisions. Mentors who shift from encouraging to dismissive right at the moment your success becomes undeniable. And the most disorienting part of this experience is that these people will rarely, if ever, tell you what is actually happening. Because what is actually happening lies beneath the level of conscious awareness for most of them. They do not sit down and think, I feel threatened by this person, and therefore I am going to undermine them. The threat response in human beings is largely automatic, largely unconscious, and largely expressed through behavioral signals that the person themselves would deny if confronted. Today, you are going to learn how to read those signals. Not to become paranoid, not to view every relationship through a lens of suspicion, but because understanding when someone feels threatened by you is one of the most practically important social skills you can develop. It will help you protect your energy, your opportunities, and your peace of mind. And it will help you navigate these dynamics with the kind of psychological sophistication that most people never develop because they never understood what was happening in the first place. Before we get into the 8 signs, you need to understand the psychology driving this behavior at the root level. Social comparison theory, developed by psychologist Leon Festinger at MIT in the 1950s and expanded by decades of subsequent research, established that human beings compulsively and automatically evaluate themselves in relation to the people around them. This is not vanity or weakness. It is a deeply wired survival mechanism. In the ancestral human environment, your status relative to others in your group determined your access to resources, mate, safety, and survival. So your brain evolved to monitor your comparative standing with constant vigilance. The problem in the modern world is that this ancient comparison system does not distinguish between a genuine threat to your survival and the discomfort of watching someone in your social circle succeed in ways that highlight your own unfulfilled potential. When someone in your environment grows faster than you, advances further than you, or develops qualities you wish you had, your brain can register that as a threat signal. And when that threat signal fires, behavior changes, usually in ways the person is not fully conscious of. And those behavioral changes are exactly what you are going to learn to read. Sign 1. They minimize your achievements immediately and reflexively. You share good news. You mention a win. You describe something you are proud of. And before the moment has even fully landed, the threatened person is already contextualizing it downward. Oh, that is great, but the market is really good for everyone right now. Or anyone could have gotten that with your connections. Or honestly, I heard that company has been struggling anyway. The speed of this response is the tell. Genuine happiness for someone else takes a moment to arrive because it requires the brain to process the other person's success as separate from its own status. But the threatened person's response is immediate because it is not a conscious choice. It is a defensive reflex. Research on social comparison and self-evaluation maintenance theory from Abraham Tesser at the University of Georgia found that when someone close to us succeeds in a domain that is important to our own self-concept, our brain automatically generates responses designed to reduce the psychological threat that success represents. Minimizing your achievement is not cruelty. It is a pain management strategy running on autopilot in someone who has not developed the self-awareness to interrupt it, recognizing it for what it is rather than internalizing it as an accurate assessment of your achievement is the only psychologically sane response. Sign 2. They become oddly competitive over things that were never competitions. Before your growth, this person was collaborative, warm, and mutual in the relationship. But something shifted. Now they turn casual conversations into subtle competitions. They cannot hear you mention an accomplishment without immediately countering with one of their own. They cannot engage with your ideas without positioning their own ideas as superior. They monitor your social media metrics, your professional progress, your relationship status, and your lifestyle with an attention that goes beyond casual interest. Research on competitive behavior and social threat from the field of evolutionary psychology shows that competitive responses are most intense not between strangers or distant rivals, but between people who occupy similar social niches. The person who feels most threatened by your advancement is almost always the person who sees themselves as most similar to you, because your success in the shared domain does not just represent your growth. To their threatened brain, it represents the closing of a gap that protected their sense of superiority, or the opening of a gap that threatens their sense of adequacy. The competition is never really with you. It is with the uncomfortable feelings your progress creates in them. Sign 3. They use humor as a delivery mechanism for genuine hostility, the joke that is not quite a joke, the compliment that lands slightly wrong, the teasing that goes 1 degree too far and then retreats behind laughter when you react. Psychology calls this phenomenon the jab and jest pattern, and it is one of the most common behavioral signatures of concealed social threat. The threatened person cannot express their feelings directly, because doing so would require acknowledging those feelings exist. So they package the hostility in plausible deniability. The joke format allows them to say things they genuinely mean while maintaining the escape hatch of "it was just a joke" if you respond. Researchers studying in-group dynamics and concealed aggression have found that this pattern is particularly common in environments where open competition or hostility would be socially costly. Workplaces, friend groups, families. Any context where direct aggression carries consequences encourages the migration of that aggression into more socially acceptable containers like humor, sarcasm, and irony. The pattern to watch for is consistency. Everyone makes an edge joke occasionally. But when a specific person's humor about you is consistently pointed, consistently focused on your perceived weaknesses or your areas of growth, and consistently delivered with a half smile that does not quite reach the eyes, you are not dealing with a comedian. You are dealing with someone who has found a socially acceptable way to manage a threat response they cannot consciously acknowledge. Sign 4. They withhold information that would genuinely help you. This one is subtle and insidious because the absence of something is always harder to detect than its presence. The threatened person does not necessarily do anything overtly harmful. They simply fail to do things that would benefit you when those things cost them nothing. They do not mention the opportunity they heard about that would be perfect for you. They do not pass along the connection that could open a door. They do not share the feedback they received about your work that would help you improve. They do not tell you about the meeting that was happening that you should have been part of. Research on information hoarding in competitive social environments from organizational psychologist Tomás Chamorro Pre-Music at University College London found that information withholding is one of the most common behavioral expressions of covert interpersonal competition. In workplaces and social groups alike, people who feel threatened by a specific individual systematically reduce the information flow to that person in ways that are almost impossible to detect or call out directly, because you cannot confront someone for not telling you something you did not know about. The most reliable way to detect this pattern is to compare how freely information flows between this person and others in the same environment versus how freely it flows to you. If there is a consistent and specific gap, you have your answer. Sign 5. They are excessively critical of you in group settings, but warm in private. The social performance of criticism is one of the most revealing signs of concealed threat because it exposes the underlying motive with unusual clarity. When a person genuinely disagrees with you or has constructive concerns about your approach, they tend to raise those concerns privately or at minimum in contexts where the goal is genuine problem solving. But the threatened person raises their criticism in group settings specifically, in meetings, at social gatherings, in front of the people whose opinion of you matters most. The audience is not incidental, it is the entire point. Research on social undermining from Lad Wheeler at the University of Rochester defines this pattern as deliberate behavior designed to reduce another person's social standing, reputation, and perceived competence in the eyes of others. The target of social undermining experiences it as confusing precisely because it coexists with warmth in private. But the confusion dissolves when you understand the mechanism. In private, this person has no audience and therefore no social leverage to deploy. In group settings, your reputation is a resource they can diminish, and diminishing your reputation in the eyes of others is one of the most effective ways the threatened brain knows to restore the comparative standing that your growth has disrupted. Sign 6. They take an unusual interest in your failures and struggles. Pay attention to who lights up when you are struggling, who asks follow-up questions about your setbacks with just slightly too much engagement, who seems to exhale with barely concealed relief when something does not go your way. who references your past failures more frequently than your past successes. This behavioral pattern is driven by what German psychology calls Schadenfreude, which is the experience of pleasure derived from another person's misfortune, and research from the University of Leiden using neuroimaging found that Schadenfreude activates the brain's reward circuits in the same way that personal success does. When a threatened person witnesses your struggle, their brain registers it as a reduction in the threat you represent and rewards that perception with a burst of pleasurable neurochemistry. They are not consciously celebrating your pain. Their brain is doing something automatic and neurochemical that their behavior then reflects before their social awareness can filter it. The micro-expression of relief. The slightly too interested follow-up question. The memory that is oddly precise about your failures while being oddly vague about your successes. These are the behavioral fingerprints of a brain that has registered your difficulty as its relief. Sign 7. They copy your ideas, style, or approach without acknowledgement. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, goes the saying. But imitation without acknowledgement in a context of existing social tension is something psychologically different. It is a specific behavioral pattern where a threatened person simultaneously wants to diminish your value and extract it for their own use. They dismiss your idea in the meeting and then present a nearly identical version of it 2 weeks later as their own. They criticize your approach and then quietly adopt its most effective elements without attribution. They undermine your style or choices publicly and then privately incorporate them into their own presentation. Research on identity threat and behavioral mimicry from social psychologist Roy Baumeister at the University of Florida found that people who feel their identity or status is threatened by another person's qualities sometimes engage in what he calls competitive incorporation, which is the unconscious adoption of the threatening person's strengths as a way of neutralizing the competitive advantage those strengths represent. Recognizing this pattern requires you to track behavior over time rather than in isolated incidents. A single instance of overlapping ideas proves nothing. A consistent pattern of dismissal followed by adoption is deeply revealing. Sign 8. They respond to your boundaries with disproportionate anger or hurt. When a person who feels threatened by you encounters a limit you set, their response is rarely proportionate to the actual boundary. You decline an invitation and they interpret it as a personal rejection. You assert a professional boundary and they respond as if you have made a declaration of war. You choose to spend time on your own development instead of being available for them, and they frame it as abandonment or betrayal. The disproportionality of the response is the key diagnostic. Research on interpersonal boundaries and attachment from clinical psychologist Stan Tatkin, whose work on human attachment systems in adult relationships, found that disproportionate responses to ordinary limits almost always reflect something the limit touches in the responder rather than anything truly unreasonable about the limit itself. For the threatened person, your boundaries are not just preferences, they are disruptions to a dynamic they depend on. A dynamic where your availability, your agreeableness, and your accessibility have been part of what kept the threat your growth represents feeling manageable. When you set a limit, you are changing the terms of the relationship in ways that force them to confront the feelings they have been managing through the dynamic. And those feelings are uncomfortable enough to produce a response that is wildly disproportionate to whatever you actually did. Here is what you need to carry from this video into your actual life. When someone feels threatened by you, it is not about you. Not really. It is about the gap between who they are and who they want to be, and how your growth has made that gap more visible and more painful for them to sit with. Understanding this does not mean you accept mistreatment. It does not mean you ignore these patterns or excuse the behavior they produce. It means you respond to it from a place of clarity rather than confusion, from a place of compassion where possible, and from a place of self-protection where necessary. The most sophisticated response to a threatened person is never to make yourself smaller to relieve their discomfort. It is to continue growing with enough self-awareness to recognize what you are navigating, and enough psychological grounding to navigate it without losing yourself in the process. Your growth is not the problem. Their relationship with their own potential is, and that is something only they can solve.